Welcome everybody to this webinar on EPA's PFAS Action Plan, hosted by the National Governors Association's Center for Best Practices. And sorry for starting just a minute late. We were having a little technical difficulties, but hopefully that will be the end of them for this webinar. This is Bevan Bucheister, and I lead NGA's Water Policy Learning Network, and I'll be the moderator today, along with my colleague Timothy Schoenhoven. Before we begin, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and a link will be posted to NGA's website, along with a PDF of the slides for you to further look at later. We encourage you to ask questions, so Timothy and I will be monitoring the chat box and the Q&A box that you should see on the bottom of your screen. Just type your questions in there, and we'll be asking your questions to the speakers. Some of them, if they're relevant, we can ask them throughout the presentation, but mostly we were planning on asking them at the end of the presentation during the Q&A period. So as you all know, PFAS is a group of synthetic chemicals that have include PFOA and PFAS. They've been used since the 1940s in consumer and industrial products and things like non-stick coating for cooking pans, waterproofing and stain prevention coatings for clothing, carpet, and lots of other materials, and also in firefighting foam. So these chemicals and the next generation of these chemicals are being found in drinking water, wastewater, groundwater, and soils across the country, which is causing great public concern and concern for elected officials as well, since the chemicals have been linked to cancer, hormone disruption, reduced immune response, and lots of other bad health impacts. So EPA has been taking actions on PFAS for many years, and in 2006 they initiated a voluntary industry phase out of PFAS and PFOA. In 2009 they issued a health advisory of 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFAS in drinking water. In 2012 and 2015 they did nationwide testing to determine exposure levels. And in 2019, they released the EPA PFAS Action Plan, and in 2020, they released a preliminary determination to regulate PFAS in drinking water. So states are also moving ahead, and they're beginning to set PFAS limits for drinking water and groundwater cleanup standards, and also phase out the use of firefighting foam and food packaging and recovering costs for cleanup for manufacturers. So some states have been active for over a decade in this area. Others are responding to more recent information, and others may be waiting for EPA to adopt a drinking water standard. So with all these moving parts and going at different speeds and different levels of government, it led to some questions from our Water Policy Learning Network, who are the governor's advisors, about how EPA's strategy to address PFAS will support state actions or interact with state actions on standard setting for drinking water and other cleanup actions. And they also asked, why does it take so long to set a national standard? What's involved here? And what is the best approach to take with almost like 4,000 variations of PFAS chemicals approved by for use by the FDA. Now, all of them are not in use. I think there's maybe like 400 that are in use. So we've invited two speakers from EPA, Joe Brzezowskis and Taylor Meredith, to give an overview of EPA's PFAS Action Plan. And we asked them to discuss the process for adopting a national drinking water standard, update us on the regulatory activities, and let us know how EPA process impacts or can support state efforts. So I want to introduce our speakers. Joe serves as the Associate Administrator for the EPA Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Relations. So he's EPA's primary liaison to Congress and state and local governments. He also served as Associate Deputy years on Capitol Hill, first as counsel for the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and later as senior counsel and subcommittee staff director for the Environment Subcommittee of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. So welcome, Joe. We also have Taylor Meredith. She's the senior advisor for strategic initiatives to the EPA administrator. During her time at EPA, Taylor has worked on a variety of regulations and implementation of priority issues like the Superfund Task Force and the PFAS Action Plan. Previously, she served as policy counsel to the Assistant Administrator's Office of Land and Emergency Management. So that's the OLEM office that does a Superfund at EPA. And prior to that, she was Associate Counsel for the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. So we have a wealth of knowledge here with Joe and Taylor, and hope we'll be able to answer all your questions. And now I would like to turn it over to Joe and Taylor for their presentation.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having us. And one thing I just want to quickly point out, Taylor and I, do serve in roles here at EPA within the Office of the Administrator. So that does give us the ability to speak about things like the PFAS Action Plan, which is as you all know, is a plan that spans many of our program offices. In fact, all of our program offices here at the agency. But with that also said, we're happy to answer questions about specific areas to the best of our ability. And if there is something that you all have a question about, at the end, and we do need to take it back to an expert, we'll do that. With that said, let's kick it off. Next slide, please. We did have a quick background on PFAS chemicals. They've been around for a while, since the 1940s. They are, as you all know, found in a wide array of consumer products, cookware, food packaging, stain and water repellents, carpets, etc. Now, as you're probably aware, there are many PFAS chemicals. Some of the ones that we're going to speak about mostly today are PFOA, PFAS, and Gen X. PFAS and PFOA, as indicated, are ones that the agency knows well, that they've been quite extensively studied, and Taylor's going to get at her part of the presentation into some of the efforts that we're undertaking to learn more about other PFAS chemicals as well. So one of the issues with PFAS chemicals, as I'm sure you're aware, they have very strong carbon fluorine bonds, and they can be very persistent in the environment, and their degradation periods can last years, decades, or even longer under natural conditions. Let's move on to the next slide, which is the PFAS Action Plan. So the administrator identified that the agency needed to take action to address PFAS chemicals, and do so aggressively, and to prioritize PFAS as an issue area that the agency needed to address. So what he did was he directed all of the program offices to undertake the PFAS Action Plan, which is the first multimedia, multi-program national research management and risk communication plan to address a challenge such as PFAS. So what happened first is that we took the feedback that we were given from various community events. We received over 120,000 comments in the public docket. We had visits to impacted communities. We took this information and we developed a plan that involves our Office of Water, our Office of Land and Emergency Management, our Enforcement Office, and our Office of Research and Development, and even our Office of Air and Radiation is involved, and developed this plan to address PFAS chemicals. So I want to point to some of the major accomplishments that the agency has made with regards to the action plan. we've made progress in all of the program areas. Some of the highlights, we put out a groundwater cleanup guidance. We finalized new testing methods. We've updated and I can't believe I left out our Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, and our program office is very important. We updated the toxics release inventory and finalized a significant new use rule. And we issued a preliminary regulatory determination for PFOA and PFAS in drinking water. And actually, just late last month, we've also submitted interim guidance on the destruction and disposal of PFAS materials containing PFAS, which is as a first step towards fulfilling some of the requirements of the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. And then we also have transmitted the Unregulated Containment Monitoring Rule, the UCMR 5 proposal to OMB for interagency review. So we are continuing to make strides to formulate to accomplishing the goal of the PFAS Action Plan.
So Joe, this is Bevan. I'm just going to break
Sure.
in, and I'm going to be the acronym police. So the UCMR, you're going to have to explain that to our group. I'm not sure. We have policy generalists and policy experts online. So
Understood.
Can you explain what the UCMR is?
Yeah, so that's the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. The UCMR 5, that will, we would anticipate that if it is, again, it's an interagency review, so I want to be just careful here, since can't overspeak when things are in that area, but we anticipate that would would allow for the utilization of new methods that can detect PFAS that could not be detected before. So it's a way that we can hopefully assist in the detection of PFAS chemicals. But there's more to come on that, because it is in interagency review.
Do you want me to provide a quick background point, Joe, too, for everybody?
Please do.
I know a lot of you are water experts, but just as a point of background, so the UCMR is under the Safe Drinking Water Act amendments in 1996. It requires that once every 5 years, EPA issues a new list of no more than 30 unregulated contaminants to be monitored by public water systems, and then the occurrence data through that that we collect supports our determination of whether to regulate particular contaminants that may be of a potential public health concern. So that's the background, and as Joe was saying, this is just the next rule, since it's been the 5-year increment.
We didn't lose you, right? I just want to make sure, because my computer decided to sleep there for a second.
Right, we can still hear. We can still hear you both. So thanks. That was a good explanation, and thank you. Thank you for that.
For sure. So looking. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask. So I thought that that EPA tested for PFAS in the 2012 or 13 to 15 time frame. So, but now this updated UCMR, this updated testing, you're using new testing methods? Is that what the difference is?
So you're correct. The UCMR 3 in 2017 collected drinking water data for 6 PFAS, which were PFOA, PFAS, PFBS, PFNA, PFHXS, and PFHPA. And so yes, this is expanding it to a list of other PFAS chemicals.
Okay, thanks. And go ahead, Joe.
Sure, and so again, the anticipation there is that this will be a proposed rule once it gets out of interagency review and will be open for public comment. Yeah, so let us move on to the next. We're already there at drinking water. Excellent. We have made a number of strides here on the Safe Drinking Water Act side of things. So in February 2020, February 20th, in fact, we did release a proposal to regulate PFAS and PFOA in drinking water. And the comment period for that rule closed on June 10th. And we are currently reviewing and considering comments received to determine next steps. And in fact, the comment period was originally slotted to close on May 11th, but we did extend that period for an additional 30 days. So as I said, we're still reviewing those. Let's see, a couple of other things that we've done here. In this proposed rule, EPA, we requested information and data on other PFAS substances, as well as comments on potential monitoring requirements and regulatory approaches EPA is considering for PFAS. So, I don't want to prejudge any of the outcomes on how we will, address those comments as we consider whether or not to move forward, but understand that we are currently in the process of analyzing those comments and seeing where what steps are necessary to take. And then, as you can see there on the slide, we have the bullet on the rule that Taylor just explained, the UCMR 5, which is our latest action in the Safe Drinking Water Act area. So we can move on to the next slide. And so just, I think we do tend to get a lot of questions about how long it takes to set standards for chemicals like PFOA and PFAS. I just want, this is a graphical depiction of sort of all the steps within the Safe Drinking Water Act there are to develop a drinking water standards. You'll see in the upper left-hand corner, that's the contaminant candidate list. So there's a draft list and a final list. It's published every 5 years. From that list, then you have the sort of flowing downwards into the unregulated monitoring program rules, which we've just explained about the testing methods and how to identify these chemicals in water systems. And then you have that flows into the regulatory determinations box, which, as you know, we issued, I believe the regulatory determination was back in December. I believe that was back in December of 2019, which then flowed into the proposed rule, which came out in February. Again, we have to take into the comments into effect and see if that proceeds into a final regulatory, proposed regulatory determination, then final regulatory determination, which then flows into a proposed rule and a final rule, which then would set the standard. So it's a long process. This is a process that's required in the statute within the Safe Drinking Water Act. So we do get this question a lot, especially from members of Congress. Why does it take so long? Well, this is what Congress told the agency to do. This is the process that they've that's within the statute. This is just a graphical representation of sort of all of the steps.
So Joe, this is Bevan. I'm breaking in again just for a question on this slide. So I see there's some time frames between some of the steps.
Yeah.
But so where is the kind of the real time that the time I see there's like no time between the preliminary regulatory determination and the final regulatory determination. Is that where the real time lag is between a lot of these procedures?
Yeah, so I think these are what we've provided here is sort of a generalized timeline. I mean, in some of these, in fact, are timeframes that are required within the Safe Drinking Water Act. So, you know, we're working as expeditiously as possible with regards to the PFOA and PFAS, for example. You know, I think, you know, you have identified, right, an issue there, sort of how long it might take from getting from preliminary to final. And again, a lot of those things are based on how many comments we receive, and sort of what, you know, the complexity of the chemicals, you know, our scientific understanding of those chemicals. I think, you know, PFOA and PFAS, again, we have a decent understanding of those two. That may not be the, you know, we might not have the same amount of scientific information on other kinds of chemicals. So it really is a case-by-case type basis. And then some of it is statutorily based.
Okay, and then can you expand on the 6-year review after the final rule is published? When the final rule is adopted, I mean, do drinking water utilities have to follow that then, or what's happening in this review period?
Well, certainly if there's a final rule that's issued, then yes, there are, you know, it is the regulation of the agency. On the 6-year review specifically, I'm going to have to get back to you.
Oh, okay. And also there was a specific question about the UCMRs in the chat box. Barbara Morris asked about the UCMR 5. She asked, will it apply to a much wider set of public water systems than previous UCMRs? So yeah, there's usually a subset, so it's a representative amount, a number of systems that are tested.
Yeah, and thank you very much for the question. Unfortunately, given the fact that the rule is in an interagency review, I can't comment about the scope.
Okay.
All right, so if we could go on to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So toxics, which I have to admit, I greatly, when I named all our program offices, I left off our Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, which was certainly not intentional. So we've been very active in this area. We most very recently have taken action in May and June, as you can see on the slide there. In May, we issued a final rule that added 172 PFAS chemicals to the toxics release inventory reporting, which was required by the National Defense Authorization Act. To give you a little bit of an explanation, the toxic release inventory, it tracks the management of certain toxic chemicals that may pose a threat to human health and the environment. So sort of more specifically, through annual reporting, it provides information about listed toxic chemical releases and related pollution prevention activities by covered industrial and federal facilities. So this TRI data, I think, supports a lot of communities and government agencies, companies, and others. So this was a requirement, as I said, under the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. And then in June of 2020, we released the Significant New Use Rule, which is under the Toxic Substances Control Act. So we called that a SNUR, the Significant New Use Rule, or SNUR, and Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. So the issuance of a SNUR under TSCA requires manufacturers and processors of certain PFAS chemicals to notify the EPA at least 90 days prior to starting or resuming new uses of that chemical. So specifically, what the June action did is that before certain PFAS are reintroduced into the United States, EPA is using its authority to designate certain uses of PFAS as, quote, a significant new use. So this would ensure review and make determinations as to whether these new uses present an unreasonable risk to the public. I think this particular significant new use rule does impact certain things like surface coating and carpets that contain certain kinds of PFAS that in fact can no longer be imported into the United States without further EPA review. So that those are sort of two of the most recent actions that we've taken on the toxic side.
Oh, Joe, and Taylor, while we're advancing slides, we also had a question about the National Defense Authorization Act. Did it require you to adopt or create interim guidance on destruction of PFAS too? Was that in the NDAA, or was that outside of the NDAA?
So I believe that.
I don't know if you want to jump in, Joe. I saw that in the question box. It's actually covered on this slide that Joe's about to.
Okay, sorry.
Yes.
And I can supplement after that.
Thank you. That was one of the things that I mentioned actually in my sort of opening as to some of our most recent actions to fulfill our mandate under the PFAS Action Plan. So yes, just last month we issued interim guidance on destruction and disposal of PFAS. It's to OMB for interagency review. So as the slide indicates, the guidance would provide information on technologies that may be feasible and appropriate for the destruction and disposal of PFAS, and identify ongoing research and development activities related to destruction and disposal technologies, which may inform future guidance on that.
And to answer the question in the chat box, yes, this was a requirement in the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. It required EPA to publish interim guidance on destruction and disposal of PFAS within 1 year, which would be by January 2021. So yeah, this is the proposed guidance that just went to OMB for interagency review, and we are on target to meet our deadline.
So we are taking significant additional action in PFAS cleanup. We are facilitating efforts through the interim groundwater recommendations for federal cleanup programs. And we have initiated the regulatory development process for designating certain PFAS as hazardous substances under our CERCLA authorities. Just give me one second. I need to keep moving my mouse because my computer likes to go to sleep. Anyway, we're back. That and then the guidance is our newest action there. Any questions on CERCLA issues? Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So enforcement, which is very important. We are continuing to use our enforcement tools where appropriate to address PFAS exposure in the environment and assist states in these enforcement activities. And I think as the slide indicates there, we finalized an agreement in May with Swix, which I think is the ski wax company, that resolves some TSCA violations associated with importation of ski wax that contain PFAS. We do intend to employ an enforcement strategy that relies first on state and local authorities and utilizes federal authorities as appropriate. Additionally, if the EPA finds that there may be an imminent and substantial endangerment to public health related to PFAS, the agency will determine whether using its authorities is the most effective mechanism to protect human health and the environment. So we are taking action, enforcement action, where necessary on PFAS violations.
So Joe, can I ask you, this is Bevan, I just want to jump in and ask you, so what are the enforcement authorities that EPA has now? So there isn't a drinking water standard yet, so there's no enforcement to do on that. There's a health advisory, but that's guidance, it's not a requirement. For groundwater, was there a groundwater cleanup standard, or I thought that was guidance as well? So I'm just wondering, what are the enforcement actions, and what are the authorities?
So there's a chart in the PFAS Action Plan that shows you each of the enforcement actions EPA has taken. It's actually still almost current. There's been 2 new enforcement actions since then that are added, and you can see the authorities relied on for each. The majority have been under the Safe Drinking Water Act. But there's one CERCLA enforcement action, and unfortunately, I don't think Joe or I are the experts to go into the details on each enforcement action, but you can read more about them in the action plan.
Okay. And also on your second bullet there was mentions providing supports to states, and we did have a question, I don't know if it was in the chat box or the Q&A box, but it was one of the early questions. It said, are there available resources for states that are struggling to conduct investigations and implement state action plans? And you might get to that later in your slides, and if you do, answer then.
Yeah, I'll be talking about some of the technical assistance we're providing to states. It's really more focused on the research front, so I'm not sure about the particular question, but one thing I'll go ahead and mention now that I was going to later is we'll be providing a table with these slides for all the attendees that provides you with your best PFAS point of contact in your local EPA region, so you can reach out to them and maybe see how they can assist.
Yeah, we're more than happy to try to follow up and give the resources, certainly on the enforcement side of things, for sure.
Sure, and we'll get that out to everybody who registered. Thanks.
Great. Next slide, please. All right, so before we go into research and scientific innovation, where Taylor will pick up with the presentation, I wanted to just kind of go over a couple of sort of recent actions on Capitol Hill in terms of I would call a legislative update. The Congress has been rather active, maybe not as active this summer as they were last year when it comes to PFAS, but certainly we see in the House of Representatives HR 535, that's the PFAS Action Act, that's the main House bill, which it continues to kind of be offered up as a potential amendment to these National Defense Authorization Acts. And in fact, it was not adopted into the FY 2021 bill, but it is a rather robust piece of legislation. It requires the agency to set Safe Drinking Water Act standards in a certain period of time. It requires EPA to make determinations about all PFAS chemicals designated as hazardous substances, and amongst other provisions. It's rather comprehensive. Couple of other, as I mentioned, the National Defense Authorization Act. There's actually there are 2 bills because the Senate passed theirs and the House passed theirs a bill, so they have to go to conference and get together and resolve the differences in them and see if they can come to an agreement there. Couple of provisions in each just to flag, not necessarily EPA related, but notable. you know, there in the Senate bill, there's some language to conduct research on AFFF, that's the firefighting foam. A couple of research funding increases at places like CDC and others. In the House bill, there's some provisions that would increase reporting of PFAS to spills, usage, and contamination. There are some provisions to address the AFFF, the firefighting foam, and some other sort of related provisions. As I said, none of these are really these are not as impactful to EPA. They do either impact DoD or other agencies. And then I just want to note two other potential vehicles here. There's a bill coming out of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee at HR 2 that was passed in July in the House. That establishes a grant program for the Safe Drinking Water Act to provide assistance to water utilities to pay for capital costs associated with the treatment of PFAS. And then it adds a definition of PFAS to the Safe Drinking Water Act as well. And then it does authorize the EPA to award some grant money to owners and operators of publicly owned treatment works to implement clean water permit limits for the discharge of PFAS-related chemicals or other pollutants as potential contaminants of emerging concern. And then finally, the Water Resources Development Act. Again, this is a situation where we've got competing Senate and House bills, and the Senate bill does have some grant money attached to it. And then the Senate bill also requires the EPA to set a national primary drinking water regulation for PFOA and PFAS within 2 years of enactment. So that is, I think, important to lay out. And then the House bill does not have as much language sort of impactful for the agency here. So anyway, I'm gonna kick it over to Taylor now to start her presentation.
Before we hop into the research and science, can I just ask a question? So, you know, I'm not don't want to look into the future and say whether it was going to pass or not. You know, whether they're going to require EPA to pass a standard in 2 years. But we do have a question about what happens when when and if EPA does adopt a national standard, and then how does that interact with the state standards and the standards that they have established? I know New Hampshire was out of the gate, I think New Jersey's established one, and there's a whole lot of other states where it's in process. So
yeah, so thanks for the question. Yeah, so the Safe Drinking Water Act, I think it's section 1414E. It allows states to be to set more stringent standards than EPA, and so essentially to have primary enforcement authority, which a state must only demonstrate that its requirements are at least as stringent as the federal drinking water standards that are promulgated by EPA. So if EPA does release a federal standard, the state standards, in order to have primacy, would have to be at least as stringent as the EPA standard. They could be more stringent. Is that helpful, or would I?
Yeah, I think that was the question. So states can adopt their own standards before EPA, or in the absence of an EPA standard, but even if EPA does pass a standard, as long as the state standard is as stringent and as protective of the EPA standard, that's fine. It can be lower and more stringent than the EPA standard. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's on the waterfront. Under CERCLA cleanup, there would be an analysis of if the applicable standard, or if the standard was an ARAR, an applicable or relevant and appropriate requirement, and if it would apply for a specific Superfund cleanup.
So if there was a different state standard for cleanup.
For hazardous substance, okay. That's correct.
Right. For soil or different mediums, yeah.
Okay, because some states I know have set groundwater cleanup standards, but I think so you're saying, and so what happens there when they look and see if the state standard is an ARAR or?
Right, just under the CERCLA process, because there's often, you know, there's state standards that will vary from the federal standard. You would look and see if
Okay.
it is considered an ARAR to apply for the cleanup. And that's just a part of the process, you know, for any contaminant, not just PFAS, right?
Okay, so it can't automatically just be more stringent and super stringent. It has to fit this criteria of the ARAR, right?
That's for CERCLA cleanups.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thanks. I think that clarifies it. So I'll let you go and address your slides there.
Are you?
Yep.
All right. Okay. Do you want to turn off your sound, Joe? Okay. Thank you. Trying to make sure we don't have any echo. So hi, everyone. Again, I'm Taylor Meredith, and I may be biased, but I think I got the better half of the slides here because I think that the research that EPA is doing on the PFAS front is really exciting. And frankly, I don't think we talk about it often enough. The federal regulatory actions we've been talking about just now that are outlined in the PFAS Action Plan really get all the attention. And we don't discuss the great work that our scientists are doing right now to help us learn more about these chemicals and to support those potential regulatory actions. So, you know, I think we would all agree that PFAS is an important issue. And I think we would also all agree that we need to learn more about it. We need additional data and information so that we can better understand risks, make sure we're taking the right actions, and as I mentioned, support potential regulatory actions. So that's why we have really placed such a strong emphasis on this area of research. It is sprinkled all throughout the PFAS Action Plan, even though it doesn't get covered by the press or the Hill as much as the federal regulatory action. So not only is this to help the agency improve our understanding of these chemicals, but also we want to be able to provide certainty to you guys, our state customers, so that you have good research and data to rely on. So the scope of our research actions kind of fall under 4 general lines of work that I want to quickly go through, and then I'll go into more detail on the coming slides. So this is a combination of either in-house or extramural or cross-government collaborations through various partnerships that we have with 4 goals. First is developing and validating methods to measure PFAS in environmental and biological media. Second is understanding the human health and ecological effects of PFAS. Third is understanding PFAS sources, occurrence, fate, and transport and exposure. And last is understanding methods for reducing, removing, and remediating PFAS in the environment. So I know I went through those quickly, but like I said, I'll go into more detail in the coming slides. So Timothy, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so first, analytical methods to detect and measure PFAS. So we've been developing and working on developing and validating sampling and analytical methods to quantify PFAS of concern in water, soil, solids, air, and tissues of concern, and developing advanced methods for keeping up with industry innovation and enabling the detection of new PFAS in different environmental media. On the toxicity front, we have a multi-pronged approach. We've been collecting and reviewing information from scientific literature on PFAS toxicity in human and ecological populations. We've also been performing studies for PFAS where we have limited or insufficient data. And then for those PFAS where we do have sufficient data, we've been working on developing standard EPA human toxicity reference values. Next, working on PFAS exposure research and development. We've been collecting and reviewing PFAS exposure data, building data sets, tools, and predictive models of PFAS sources, transport, fate, and exposure using the agency's exposure tools. So pursuing lots of research and development in all 3 of these areas to help us improve our knowledge to support our regulatory actions. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so and then another big area where we receive a lot of inquiries is on PFAS treatment and remediation and materials management. So the first issue is removing PFAS from drinking water. So we've been working on analyzing and documenting the cost and effectiveness of commercially available approaches to treat drinking water that's contaminated with PFAS. We use that data to populate and refine our drinking water treatability database. And we also use it to update drinking water costs and performance models that are available on our website. And I do want to draw your attention to, I guess it was almost a month ago now, July 15th, we added new treatment options for 4 new PFAS compounds and added 20 new scientific references to our drinking water treatability database. So that will help us, increase our depth of knowledge on this area. And we think it's an important tool that's available to you all as well, to use these new technologies to better manage PFAS in drinking water and to protect public health. We also have been synthesizing literature and initiating field work to understand the life cycle implications of long-term management of PFAS. So that's from PFAS containing materials like biosolids or industrial waste, household goods. Joe talked about AFFF earlier, the firefighting foam. And this research also includes understanding some alternatives for disposal, like, for example, thermal treatment of these different PFAS sources. And that we're doing a lot of research in this area, which would support one of the actions we talked about earlier, being the interim guidance on disposal and destruction of PFAS. So if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so this is, I think this is really cool. We recently, earlier this year, developed what we call the PIT, which is the PFAS Innovative Treatment Team, and they are really focused on what I was just talking about, the destruction of PFAS. So we brought together multidiscipline research teams throughout our Office of Research and Development and dedicated them full-time to this team to concentrate on this single problem of removing, destroying, and testing PFAS contaminated media and waste. So their 3 goals are right here, you can see on the screen. And they expect to put out results of this very rapid research project later this year. And again, our hope here is this will provide all of you with data on viable approaches for destruction and disposal of PFAS, so you can have more confidence in decisions for cleanup operations and ensuring that your communities are safe. So that we also had an announcement on that last July that I'll share with you. So July 1st, our PIT completed a memorandum of understanding with a US-based company that specializes in disposal of biosolids, green waste, and biomass. And we are planning to conduct field research with them this summer. We also continue to line up other field and laboratory research projects for the remainder of the summer to study ways to destroy PFAS, and we've been meeting with several groups to conduct field sampling at AFFF incineration facilities. So this particular group has just really taken this problem, this bull by the horns, and has focused on it full time, and I think we're doing some really innovative and interesting work there. Next slide, please. So another area that I get really excited about, and I don't think we talk about often enough, is all the work we're doing with you guys, because you all share the same concerns on these issues, want to learn new information just as we do, and I think that we all benefit from collaboration. And so I was actually able to confirm with our Office of Research and Development that EPA has been in talks with or working with all of you who are attending today's webinar, which is great. As I mentioned earlier, despite that we already have working relationships, we still encourage you to reach out and work with the regions, because even if there's not maybe new projects that we would do in your community, maybe something we're doing somewhere else in the country can be beneficial to you, and we can make sure we're sharing information. And you can see this is something that the administrator finds very beneficial. I love that he talks about how these partnerships allow for collaboration, like I discussed, but encouraging cutting edge research and that information sharing that we think is so important. Next slide, please.
So again, we think these issues are just as important as the progress that everybody's been talking about on the regulatory front at the federal level, because this is where we're really getting a lot of great work done and improving our knowledge in a collaborative fashion. So I just listed 3 examples here on this slide. Work that we did with Michigan analyzing PFAS and chrome electroplating operations, work we did with New Hampshire to analyze PFAS in different media at a specific industrial site and in close proximity to the site. And then lastly, working with West Virginia to analyze PFAS samples that were collected during air emission testing at an industrial facility. I'm also going to plug last month, like 2 weeks ago now, if you go to our website, every region put out a press release talking about the different technical assistance they're providing to states or state partnerships that they're engaged in on the PFAS front. So if you go to our website, you can read way more examples than we have here for all of the regions, and we'll continue to make sure we update those and highlight that work so you all can see what others are doing and information share. Next slide, please. So money, it's always great to talk about money, right? Last year, we awarded about $3.9 million through 2 grants to improve our understanding of human and ecological exposure to PFAS in the environment. It's also focusing on restoring water quality in communities that have been impacted by PFAS. And then later last year, we awarded $6 million to 8 organizations to expand understanding of environmental risks that are posed by PFAS and waste streams. And then in a few weeks here, we will be awarding another $4.8 million in funding, and this is for federal research to identify the impacts of PFAS on agriculture and rural communities. Next slide, please. And then I think this is my last slide here, but again, I think the main message that I wanted to get across today is we think it's all about collaboration, and we are so appreciative of the work we're able to do together. And I was so pleased to hear that we are already working with all of you or in discussions with all of you. Beyond the states and the state associations, we are also making sure we collaborate and work well with all of our federal partners, since we all have interests in this issue. Another announcement, last month was a big month. Another announcement that came out in July is that we are partnering with DOD, with USDA and HHS we engage the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and we're coordinating a workshop that will likely take place in October. And the purpose of the workshop is to review federal PFAS research efforts and help us identify possible research and data gaps. So this can help us ensure that the research that's being done across the federal government is properly coordinated, it's complementary, and that we're avoiding any unnecessary duplication. So look out for that. It'll be open to the public, and again, that'll be sometime in October. I'm sure if you follow us on Twitter or see our press releases, we will let you know when that's scheduled. And then lastly, another important area to talk about is risk communication. This is another priority for Administrator Wheeler. He wants to make sure that when we're in communities, we're not talking to folks like in the typical terminology that we sometimes all get lost in here in the Beltway, like using all these acronyms that we have been, and make sure that people actually understand the risks and potential exposures, and that they don't feel completely lost by their engagements with EPA. And so we even hired an individual who joined us last year, I believe, who is totally focused on risk communication to help the agency improve in this area. And they're working on several risk communication toolboxes, but there will be one specific to PFAS. And the goal of this is to be a tool that's available for us, for you all, for tribal partners and local partners to use with the public to help us not just message, but truly help folks understand what we're talking about and the work that we're doing in local communities. With that, I think I quickly
thanks Taylor.
5 minutes left.
Yeah, there's a few questions in the chat box, and one was, how do states access the information that the PIT is collecting about relative feasibility, performance, and cost of different treatment and disposal methods? So where can they locate that information?
Right. So the PIT's final product will be released later this year, and that will be, I'm sure, it'll be on our website. And we'll emphasize that and highlight the rollout so that you know those resources are available to you. In the meantime, I believe that our website would still give you status updates on whatever the PIT's working on that's ready for public consumption. So if we can link, or even if you just Google EPA and PFAS Innovative Treatment Team, you should be able to find more resources.
Okay, and yeah, we just wanted to invite everybody, as this slide says, to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A boxes. And if you're comfortable, include your name, title, and affiliation. And we were looking for states as well, because that might have a difference, make a difference on some of the answers. Let's see, there was another question here, going to the other boxes. Has EPA considered using TSCA Section 4 testing authority to develop additional health effects data on PFAS, and that authority allows EPA to require manufacturers and processors to test chemical substances if there's not enough information on health and environmental impacts on them, and if testing's necessary to develop that that information.
So sorry to give this answer again, but you know, Joe and I are really knowledgeable on our PFAS action plan, and there's not a particular action in this area. So I'm not aware if they've considered it.
Okay. So I just wanted to go back to setting a drinking water standard and where we actually are in that, and what's kind of like the timeline and the next steps, and because that's what the public seems to be laser focused on, so that focuses states and governors on that as well, because you know, drinking water, I mean, all this research is great and it's important, and certainly clean up and how you're going to destroy the PFAS and dispose of it is super important as well, but the public is also very focused on drinking water because connection to health impacts. So the 96 amendments required.
Oh, you faded out on us. I don't know if others
analysis and also the best available science has been done, or is that and also with the best available science, when do you decide that you have enough science? Because scientists can keep studying different aspects of things, probably forever. But
right. So I know that lots of questions packed into that question, and I know we have a minute. I have a meeting at 4, but I can quickly. I'll go through again the process of where we are, so everyone's aware. So again, we published the preliminary regulatory determination for public comment, as I'm assuming most of you saw, in February of this year. We extended the comment period due to COVID and to allow everyone additional time with the complications that came from COVID. Oh, sorry, my computer died. You have your sound on too, so I can hear any questions. So we are considering the public comments now, and again, we'll prepare a final regulatory determination, and we expect to meet our statutory deadline there of publishing that by January 2021. Now, after that, go ahead. Okay, if EPA.
Oh, no, sorry, I just said that. Yeah.
If we make a decision there and to regulate PFOA and PFAS, then we'll start the rulemaking process to establish the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation, which is in that flow chart that Joe showed earlier. And the timelines that were specified there of 18 and 24 months, those are just the timelines that are specified in the statute. And as Joe reiterated, we are working as expeditiously as possible. And as you mentioned, that process throughout it, we are considering a number of factors like the best peer-reviewed science, all the best available data. Now, how our experts in the Office of Water make those determinations on when to cut it off and say that they have sufficient information to move forward, I'm not aware. They have been kind enough to educate me on the process, but we could get more information for you if you'd like.
Okay, thanks so much, Meredith. I appreciate this, and we'll follow up with you on that, or with you know, the Office of Water on that question possibly. And so we will get the follow-up information, the contact information that you had mentioned you're going to send us. We'll send that out to all the webinar participants along with the recording. So thank you all very much. We've gone just a minute over, and I just want to thank you all for providing us with lots of great questions, and thank our speakers, Joe and Taylor. Thanks all for the great information.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.